VLR.
Obamacare. Ain't nobody got time for that.
Stupid people are ruining America.
The president just wants to take care of you. He just doesn't think you're able to do it for yourself.
There's a very thin line between communism, progressivism, Marxism, socialism.
The empire will strike back.
You still don't know that this was political.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of America Our Way. I am your host, Justin Boyd. Hope you all had a great week. Obviously, we had last week off from the holiday. Most of us at VLR took the weekend, spent it with families and everything, took the week out of the political sphere. I'm sure you all were desperately waiting to hear what side dishes the Obamas had. But, alas, we didn't go on the air. Joining me tonight, I have a special guest from the Coalition to Reduce Spending, Miss Rebecca Johansson. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, how are you tonight?
I think we're doing pretty well. We've got an exciting show
thanks
for
for
the
having
folks.
me on.
Of course. It's about time we've had you on.
Yeah, I agree.
Starting off, tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, so we are the only group nationally that focuses only on spending. So a lot of other groups obviously care about spending and do a lot of great work on it. But you also see them get drawn into a lot of other political fights. So that has its pros and cons, and I think we fill a definite void. Focusing only on spending, we can appeal across the aisle. So what we do is we do advocacy with candidates. We have a candidate pledge that they sign, and then we do information to voters about what Congress is up to.
Fantastic. Now, I actually have seen some of the stuff that you guys have come out with in terms of trying to push candidates into the right direction, into the fiscally responsible direction, into not blowing our livelihoods, if you will. And
right.
I gotta say, you guys do a really great job of calling people out on the spending, and it's not partisan. It's not partisan at all.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that we've seen history, recently and over time that single issue groups and advocacy is really what it takes, because when no one's watching, they'll do the worst possible thing. So our goal is just to make sure that somebody's watching all the time on spending, because that's really the root of the problem. I know you had mentioned Milton Friedman. One of my favorite Friedman quotes is that the task is to get the wrong people, I'm paraphrasing of course, but the wrong people to do the right thing, not just the right people. And that's one of our big goals at the coalition. Is we know that not everyone's going to agree with us on every single issue, certainly not even on spending, but if they're afraid to do the wrong thing, or if they feel pressure from their constituencies to keep spending low, then that's all it takes, I think.
No, I agree completely. I mean, generally I end every show with telling people to call their congressman, to pay attention, to talk about issues with people, and not be afraid to be politically active, because if you're not going to do it, nobody's going to do it for you as often or as effectively.
Exactly, and it's your money at stake.
Precisely, yeah. And so you generally end up just hurting yourself in those situations.
Exactly.
Now, I think one thing that's probably the most interesting in terms of budgetary messes is that we recently hit the $8 trillion mark for the national debt.
Yeah, actually 18 trillion, if you can believe it.
Excuse me, 18.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that we've come this far. This has only happened in a couple of years, and Democrats and Republicans are to blame. Bush and Obama both doubled the national debt, and I see no signs that it's going to change based on what they want to do, what the people in power want to do, unless we force them to.
Exactly. And speaking of which, I mean, this almost is perfect for what I want to bring up here. I actually have Milton Friedman, and he talks exactly about what we were just talking about. So let's take a listen to him.
That if you say you're going to pay down the debt, the political pressures to spend it are so strong that you will in fact spend it.
Why would you rather pay down the debt than return the money in the form of tax cuts?
Now, I just want to clarify here for a second before we continue on. Friedman is talking about the budget surplus that comes from the Clinton administration right before George W. Bush was set to take office. And he was giving recommendations on what to do with the budget surplus. I know, budget surplus, haha. But let's at least listen, because he talks a lot about how he feels about the national debt in general.
I personally would rather have it go back in the form of lower taxes.
Regardless of political considerations.
Regardless of political considerations.
All right, now why is that?
Question. Is it appropriate for the government to decide how much of the public's money it should devote to investment and how much it should devote to consumption? Isn't that something for you to decide and for me to decide? Is that a proper national objective? I think not. I think that the total amount of investment ought to be the amount that individuals separately, you, me, and everybody else, that part of their income that they want to use for that purpose.
So you're making a moral argument.
Absolutely.
That is simply no business of the government's because it is no business of the government's.
Right. It's not politically feasible because you quoted before the pressures on Congress to spend it. And those pressures mean that it will be spent. Divided government up to now has meant that it's hard to get agreement what to do. And even so, they've been able to put through a lot of government spending.
So
and
the notion...
history shows, over a long period of time, government will spend whatever the tax system raises, plus as much more as they can get away with. That's why you've had universal deficits.
And that's probably also why Milton Friedman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and we're all just sitting here listening to talk radio. Now, what I want to talk about is, what do you think, and what does your organization push for being done in terms of the debt?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that we are, mainly focused on reducing spending. So we're not the coalition to reduce the debt, but obviously the debt is a major part of it. So our first priority is getting government to spend less, because we think that, government interfering in the marketplace is not good for the economy, and that it allows for the type of mission creep that we see, and it allows for the type of, teetering on the brink of failure that we see from a lot of programs that are, important to liberals too. That said, I think that you can't ignore the debt when the Congressional Budget Office is saying that, we could even potentially have a fiscal crisis down the road because the debt will reach unsustainable levels. The debt is bigger than our entire economic output right now. It's bigger than GDP by about 103% of GDP. And it's just mind-boggling, the fact that we are this much in the red and no one seems to care.
Exactly. And not only that, but when you've got out-of-control spending like this and the debt keeps growing up from constant deficits, you have an increase in interest payments where the government treasuries, they say they generate, $2.5 or almost $3 trillion a fiscal year to spend. And that number actually goes down and the deficit goes up as the debt increases because you have an increase in interest on the debt, correct?
Right. And, even if you disagree that big debt is a big deal, or debt, in the first place is a problem, I think there's reasons to support, reasonable and responsible budgeting, because even if you don't think that, a debt in general is bad for the economy, and there are certainly people who don't, you've got to see that just keeping and adding on more and more with absolutely no plan to pay for it is a terrible idea.
Exactly. And as we've seen in the past, the more government spending increases, the more out of balance the free market becomes, and the more prone the economy is to stagflation and depressions and all sorts of nonsense.
Right. There was a big fluff about the Rogoff study that, the numbers weren't exactly right because of an Excel error. Made me cringe as a former political science major, because I know that was my nightmare, making a mistake like that. But I think what everyone missed is that the study, even when corrected for the statistical error, still showed the same effects. It may not have been quite as severe as people thought, but there's undeniably, I think, a connection between that and how well our economy does. I think the literature consistently supports that.
Right, and not only literature, but you can look back at recent examples in history and see these failings. The most notable example being Japan. What ought to be an incredible, thriving economy is stagnant and has been plagued by bad policy. And you had Shinzo Abe come out with Abenomics, where it was, spend, 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 and heavy on the quantitative easing, and you had this stagnant turnout. The economy did not improve after the slump. It did not accelerate, and that's why you've also had economists talking about how the American economy has had an anemic recovery at best, and a lot of people blame that on out-of-control government spending.
Right. I mean, we keep hearing recovery, and more jobs. But if you really look closer at the numbers, the economy is undoubtedly still struggling and probably will continue to for some time. We have the fact that people aren't looking for jobs being hailed as a success, when the fact is people have just given up looking for jobs. It's like the leadership is just completely out of touch on this, I think. Real people are struggling as a result of this, and programs that people do depend on will be insolvent. They'll be bankrupt within my generation, within not too many years.
Exactly. And I think another important thing to note is the entire premise behind all of this overspending is that the economy needs it, and that people need it, and they can't survive without all of these spending things. And it's draconian to even consider cutting a significant number of government employees or government programs that have been shown to not really help the economy.
Well, I think that's definitely part of it. And the sad part is that we're not even talking about significant changes that people view as draconian. For instance, the sequester. We see a lot of conservatives, a lot of so-called conservatives, becoming basically flaming liberals when it comes to tiny changes to the Pentagon budget. You see people on both sides of the aisle absolutely reacting in horror and shock at the thought that maybe we can trim fractions of percentage points off the rate of growth, which should tell you something about how frighteningly dependent the whole system is on the money keeping coming in. And the fact of the matter is, like it or not, the money's not always going to be there.
Exactly. And I think that probably politicians, had they passed a macroeconomics class, might have some insight on this. And obviously that's seen when you've got great people on spending like Massey and Amash and the like. But when you look at, just for example, like you were talking about defense spending, I believe America's number one in defense spending, and it's more than the next 26 nations combined, which are all allies.
Right. And, some people might think that that's a good idea, and I would certainly question that notion. But if you look closer, it doesn't even have to be in comparison to other countries. We're doing some really stupid stuff here at home. The NDAA deal that passed in the House today actually has a whole long list of programs that the military leaders wanted to cut, and Congress said, no, you can't.
Exactly.
It's not fair, I think, to play political games with our safety.
I couldn't agree more. And I think probably most notably, and the program that we've talked about here on the show before, is the F-35 jet program. The trillion dollar jet program, billion dollar jet program, where you've had an engine failure and it's never seen combat, and for a decade it was produced with no foreseeable utility. It hasn't seen combat at all until we went into Syria and started bombing people there.
Right. I mean, if you talk to military leaders who don't have vested interests, and there certainly are plenty of them, they'll tell you that it's an absolute embarrassment. The F-35, you had it right the first time, will cost nearly $1 trillion, if not more, over its lifetime. And we, fiddle around the edges, say we try to cut $1 million here from trust funds, or try to cut a couple $100,000 from PBS. And meanwhile, we're spending almost $1 trillion on an airplane that doesn't work, that military leaders know doesn't work. But we're so heavily invested, the military-industrial complex is so strong that, even what military leaders say doesn't matter. We just have to dig in on this poor idea.
Precisely. And if you talk to soldiers, if you talk to veterans, anybody who's been in the military, anybody who's served, they'll tell you about some of the ridiculousness that happens in the military. For example, many of you may or may not